In Mexico, Pope Francis offers hope to the poor and harsh words for Donald Trump. A former SDPD officer sues the department for discrimination and retaliation. And it's been 5 years since the Balboa Park Conservancy was established. So why is this building such a mess? I'm Kenny Goldberg, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Kenny Goldberg, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Gina Diamante, Fronteras editor for KPBS News. Hi, Gina.
Hi, Kenny.
Greg Moran, watchdog reporter for the San Diego Union-Tribune. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Kenny.
And Lisa Halverstadt, reporter for the Voice of San Diego. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for having me.
On the way home from his whirlwind trip to Mexico this week, Pope Francis said some shocking things. He said birth control may be permissible because the Zika virus poses threats to pregnant women. And he had some choice words for Donald Trump in view of his desire to build a wall to keep out immigrants and have Mexico pay for it. Gina, Pope Francis certainly shook things up this week. What did he say about birth control?
Well, he was asked if birth control or abortion would be the lesser evil in the case of the Zika virus. And he said abortion is not just a lesser evil, it's a crime. But he said avoiding pregnancy is not absolutely evil. In other words, contraception could be okay in very limited cases.
And how radical a statement was that?
Well, it's very opposite of what the Catholic Church has taught for a very long time, but the headline seems very radical. But you also have to consider that he framed it very specifically regarding the Zika virus and preventing babies from being conceived who might be at risk for microcephaly. There is some precedent within the church. He noted that Pope Paul VI had approved birth control for nuns in the Belgian Congo back in the 60s because they were being systematically raped. So there is some precedent there, and he wasn't saying contraceptive use is okay in all cases. He was really being very specific about it.
And they didn't do a backtrack on that later, and what does that tell you?
You know, it still goes with many things that the Pope has been saying about, he has chided the church for obsessing too much on sexuality and not necessarily looking at the bigger picture. He is looking at a larger picture of can we prevent these problems that have been happening. Just last night there was a story on NPR about babies with microcephaly being abandoned by their
babies
parents.
with small heads, is that?
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct. And so, you know, he is looking at that larger, picture of how do you avoid those things from happening.
Now, he also had some words to say about Donald Trump, and I understand he didn't call him the spiritual leader of North America.
No,
what did he say?
No, of what he was asked about Trump's call for a wall between Mexico and the U.S. To prevent illegal immigration, and the way the Pope said it was, talking about building walls instead of bridges is not Christian. That is the way he put it. And today the Vatican has said, this isn't anything new. He's always said that it's not Christian to talk about shutting people out. It does definitely keep in line with Catholic teachings of welcoming the immigrants and welcoming the poor and helping the poor. But, that what got people upset was the idea that he's saying Trump is not Christian.
Well, I want to ask you guys, to what extent is the message that the Pope gave in Mexico about having compassion for the poor and decrying the drug cartels, in what sense did that message get overshadowed by this whole Trump nonsense?
I mean, Trump sucks the oxygen out of the room, doesn't he? I mean, he did. Anytime he seemed to mention his name lately, the spotlight's on him. And clearly, I mean, but I think what the Pope said about Trump's policy position about this is very consistent with what he said in Mexico and these other places, which is, a very Christian, a very Catholic preaching of, the Jesus teaching, which is, like it says in Exodus. And Exodus says, don't oppress the foreigner because you were a foreigner once in Egypt, is what they're teaching to the Jews. And it goes all the way through to Paul in Galatians. He says, neither Jew nor Greek, Christian or not. We're all one body of Christ. And so, Trump's indignation was, misplaced but well placed because it got him a lot of attention.
In what way does this whole conundrum affect the presidential race, do you think, Lisa, if it does at all?
Well, what I thought was most interesting was the other candidates' response to this. Donald Trump eventually came out and kind of tempered himself a bit on his comments about the Pope, but the others are really trying to thread the needle because they recognize that a lot of the folks that they're trying to get to vote for them may also be Catholic. And I thought that John Kasich's response was most telling and amusing. In fact, he kind of said, I'm not going to go toe-to-toe with the Pope. That's not my place. Well, if you're the president, you might be in a position to be sitting down with the Pope and chatting with him.
The other thing I thought was interesting, too, is that in many ways, the Pope's comments got the majority of the attention, but Trump kind of started this, right? He had said that when the Pope was a puppet of the Mexican government, when he went there and said Mass and began to criticize it, and so he kind of fired the first shot, and you kind of don't, pick a fight with the Bishop of Rome. I mean, he's got Stalin famously said, how many legions does the divisions does the Pope has? Well, he's got a lot of moral authority. So,
and that brings up an interesting question, which is, Gina, how much power and authority does the Pope have to the lay public? We know he does what authority he has in the church, obviously. What about to the lay public?
Well, it's what's interesting is that in Mexico, they have the second largest number of Catholics as a country, following Brazil. Many Mexicans say they are Catholic. They identify themselves as Catholic, and they like the Pope. They really like Francis. But on the other hand, they don't always follow all of the church's teachings. They don't agree with everything. Like most places in the world, there is dispute over what the church is telling them to do. Pew Research says 28% of Mexicans think that contraception is morally wrong. 28%. That's not a very large number of Catholics who supposedly are following the teachings of their church. So, there's a lot of honoring the Pope. I like the Pope, but I don't like everything he has to say.
Well, what about, what about what he said about drug cartels and the poor? He didn't shy away from that in Mexico. He really talked about it.
He took that on, and that's very much of a piece of his, I think, of his papacy, so forth. He is certainly unafraid to call, balls and strikes and to call them as he sees them. And that was I thought that was in many ways, particularly for us here on the border where we see and are exposed to a lot of this violence, the most important thing he said was that he condemned the violence both by the cartels and the complicity of the government in that, and really spoke for the people who are caught in the middle, which is really his constituency. I thought, too, that just getting back to his comments about Trump, is that, and what authority or whatever the Pope has, in the context of what's going on this week in South Carolina, there are a lot of, Christians in that demographic, particularly in that state and in the Republican demographic. They're not necessarily Catholics. The Southern evangelical movement, Baptist, is not quite on board with a lot of what, Catholic teaching is in the Catholic churches. So I suspect there was a pretty well calculated shot by Trump. He knew that it would not really hurt him as much as if he said it, say, in Illinois or California or Michigan, places with very large Catholic voting populations. He's got a little bit of leeway there.
Well, he was definitely calculated. He even was looking at a pice of paper when he was responding to all of this, too, reading, which I don't think I've ever seen Donald Trump do.
And he brought in ISIS there. It was a very crafty little statement.
Finally, Gina, Donald Trump had some disparaging things to say at first about the Pope. I mean, is nothing sacred with this guy? Can he say anything and get away with it?
Well, he did last night during a town hall say, I like the Pope. I respect the Pope is the way he put it. I respect the Pope. He's got a lot of personality. And, so it was a little bit of pulling back from the vitriol of earlier in the day. And, so it makes you think, was the initial response just a quick knee-jerk reaction? But as Lisa said, when you're reading that reaction, it's not necessarily so knee-jerk.
Exactly.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Gina Diamante. A former San Diego police officer says he was sacked for complaining about an unfair policy. Matthew Francois, who's black, was fired last October, 2 days before his probation period ended. He says his problems began when his training officer in the Northeastern Division chastised him for pulling over a white motorist and running a records check. He's suing the department for discrimination. Greg, take us back to the beginning of this. What happened?
Well, Matt Francois was one of a number of recruits that have been brought into the police department. He went through the academy. He began your first year. It's kind of a probationary year where you move around a lot and you do a lot of field training. He did very well, according to this lawsuit, when in his first two kind of assignments, which is in the Southeastern Division and then in Mid-City, both of which are south of Interstate 8, the great dividing line of the city of San Diego. He says that when he moved to the Northern Division, he did the same things that he was trained to do and taught to do, both in the academy and in these other postings, which is when you pull over a motorist, you run a background check on him, you run a records check on him, you run a warrants check on him. His lawsuit says that when he did this, his field training officer, who was a white officer, kind of berated him for pulling over a white motorist and saying, look, essentially, we don't do that up here. You know, you only run records checks on people who look like a criminal. And he asked, well, what do you mean? What does a criminal look like? And the response, according to the lawsuit, was, well, people who have tattoos, people who give you lip, and people who have a lot of failure to appears on their record. That's an order to appear in court on a previous criminal case when you don't show up. In other words, a pretty broad stereotype of who and who isn't a criminal.
And that, I take it, according to this lawsuit, was not an isolated incident.
No. Later on, there was another incident later on. But really what precipitated his problems was that he then contacted another African-American officer, a sergeant, a guy named Art Scott, who also happens to be suing the police department, although he didn't know that at the time, for discrimination. And he said, you know, what do I do with this? You know, what happened? You know, what am I to do? I'm kind of being told to do different things. According to the lawsuit, Art Scott then contacted Officer Francois' supervisor to kind of talk to him, and that kind of set off a pretty hostile chain reaction among some of the officers and supervisors in the Northeastern Division who thought that there was sort of a teaming up of black officers to kind of promote their own interests, and it all kind of spiraled downhill from there.
And ostensibly, why did the department say they let this officer go?
Well, I don't, you know, in the summer he had a couple other assignments. He came back to Northeastern. He had a couple of write-ups that the lawsuit characterized as kind of minor incidences that were overblown. And then was simply told, as the police department can, that at the end of the probationary period that it just isn't working out, and you're gone.
And is it his claim that this reaction he got from his training officer and some other comments, that this is an actual policy and not just a couple statements from random police officers?
Well, I don't know if they go that far. That would be kind of a Manel claim, a civil rights claim, a pattern and practice thing. I don't know if this goes that far. He's saying that he lost his job not because of his performance, but because of these other incidences that triggered an unfair response to him, and he was retaliated against for raising questions about how the police were policing the city and their policies and things like that. And it's not. You know, it kind of sounded a chord because the city has done studies in the past about vehicle stops and racial profiling, and they do show that that if you are a non-white motorist in San Diego, you have a somewhat higher chance of getting pulled over and stopped than if you're white. And you know, this lawsuit seems to give some credence or reinforce what that statistical finding, which was released last November, found.
Yet it seems to me that that's not a problem only for San Diego. I mean, racial profiling, that's what we're talking about, correct?
Well, that's certainly been at the forefront of national conversations recently. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about this and shootings, and but the backdrop in San Diego that I would point out is at the time that this was all happening, there was a really big conversation happening about what San Diego used to do and not do in terms of tracking traffic stops. And there was then a real big community conversation when Chief Shelley Zimmerman started about whether there was racial profiling in the San Diego Police Department, and some real division between the police department having said that they had not heard from the community that there was a racial profiling problem, and then the community really firing back and saying, yeah, we think that there is a problem. And, you know, that conversation really continues today.
And this lawsuit really, not only was that initial comment by his supervisor saying we don't do that, but later on, with a different lieutenant, he kind of got the same lecture reinforced, which is, we do things differently up here in Northeastern than you do in other parts of the city. Including a comment, these are all allegations at this point, that said, these people up here vote, and, you could be pulling over a city council member or things like that. So there was he got a real vibe that, things are done differently in some communities, the predominantly white communities, than you do in other communities.
Well, what's this man's lawyer have to say about this whole affair?
Well, he says he represents both Matt Francois and the sergeant that he confided in or sought counseling in, who's also suing on kind of similar type of grounds, that this was a supervisor who, had said he witnessed and was exposed to incidences of, racism or intolerance within the police department. So the attorney, Dan Gillian, who has sued the police department in the city a lot and has, turned over a lot of rocks in the police department, says, look, these are not one-offs. These are not isolated incidents, but San Diego Police Department has a problem within its ranks of how minority officers and sergeants and supervisors are treated compared to their white counterparts, and that these are just kind of tip of the iceberg type of stuff.
What are we hearing from the police department about this suit?
Well, they just say, look, we treat everybody the same, kind of a bland sort of statement that says, look, we're unaware of this lawsuit, but as a general matter, we don't discriminate. We treat everyone the same. We don't have these policies that treat one part of the city differently than the other. City Attorney's Office has just said, we're going to defend the lawsuit. It's very early on. This was just filed, I think, January 29th or late January, so nobody's really had a chance to kind of gain traction on what these allegations are and what they may hold. So. But, the police department has come out and said, look, we don't have, a written policy that says you do things differently south of Interstate 8 than you do north of it.
Greg, let me ask you finally about the legal hurdles that this man faces in trying to prove his case. What are some of them?
Well, as I said, it's real early, so he's got a long way to go. They've got to, take depositions. They have to survive motions for summary judgment. They have to, make sure that all the claims that they, allege can survive what are, I'm sure, going to be legal attacks from the city. And then if he gets in front of the city, in front of a jury, if it ever gets that far, which could be a year or two, these are not easy cases or claims to prove or to convince juries of, because what we're going to hear from the city is probably more on why he was let go, why they didn't continue him as an officer, and that could, reflect poorly on him and weaken his case. So it's kind of hard to say, but certainly this complaint is very detailed. It has a lot of information in it. It wasn't just tossed off or scratched off at once. He went through, the State Department of Employment and Fair Housing grievance procedure and things like that, a right to sue letters. So, it'll be very interesting to see where this goes.
Okay, thanks very much, Greg. It's one of the most photographed buildings in Balboa Park. The Botanical Building is 100 years old and it's falling apart. The iconic building was supposed to get a $3 million facelift by 2015, but so far, the Balboa Park Conservancy, the park's chief fundraiser, hasn't raised nearly enough money to get the project off the ground. Here's then Mayor Jerry Sanders announcing the creation of the Balboa Park Conservancy in 2010.
We're here to announce the next steps in an important initiative to ensure Balboa Park, San Diego's cultural heart and the crown jewel of our park system for the past 95 years, retains its magnificence into the second century. The city simply doesn't have the resources to provide the level of care that this magnificent park deserves.
So, Lisa, why was this conservancy created in the first place then?
Well, as we just heard former Mayor Sanders say, there was a real concern about just around the time of the recession and just before about the future of the park and all of its needs and how would the city fill the gap. And so there was a big discussion, a few reports that came out that suggested, hey, let's look at models in other places like New York City, Buffalo, St. Louis. They have conservancies which kind of act as the fundraising arm for those parks that people in the community care so much about. And in some cases, conservancies have actually taken on a role where they're even helping with operations of the park or being a really key leadership function for the park. Well,
Lisa, describe what kind of shape is the building in now? If you walk up to it, what are you going to see?
Well, if you'll look closely, because often, many people go and take pictures of this building, as we were talking about earlier. But if you look closely, you'll see that some of the wood on that dome covering is kind of splitting off, that there are rusty spots. If you look behind some of the plant displays, there is a water display that has been out of commission for quite a while. So the building is falling apart, but it may just not be super apparent to people if they're not looking.
Now, the Conservancy is charged with raising money to do this makeover. How have they done so far?
Well, it's gone a bit more slowly, as you indicated, than they had planned on. They came out in about late 2013 and said that this was the project they wanted to work on and started talking about raising $3 million. Thus far, they've raised about $457,000 for that.
So that just doesn't cut it.
Not enough for the project.
What excuses are they making?
Well, they talked a lot about the centennial, and that was meant to be a year-long celebration for the 1915 exposition that just put Balboa Park on the map. Well, at the time, there was a lot of competition for fundraising, they said, but also the stories about the implosion of that proved to be a distraction. But even more pivotal, they say, was Irwin Jacobs of Qualcomm had come forward to put money down for a parking garage and a bypass bridge. His project ended up falling apart, and they said that really had a chilling effect on other philanthropists in town.
That was the same excuse that the city used with the Balboa Park Centennial Committee, right, where they couldn't pull that off because everybody was offended, or the big donor people were offended. That I think it's becoming a bit of a scapegoat for what appears to be, and it grieves me to say this, but Balboa Park, it's just such a magnificent place. What does it say that they only raised $450,000 to take care of this really iconic, really beautiful building?
Well, Gina, I want to ask you, why isn't the city coughing up some money for this thing? This is city property, isn't it?
Right. It is city property, but there's always budget issues that have to be pursued. So, considering all of the issues we have seen with other projects, especially the Plaza de Panama, can we get agreement in City Hall on what needs to be done? I think everybody agrees. Yes, we need to do something about Balboa Park. We need to save this building, but it's not necessarily what needs to be done, but how do we do it?
Well, let me throw this out there. The city wants to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a new stadium for the Chargers, and they can't spend $3 million on an iconic building in Balboa Park. What's up with that?
Well, the decision that the city made in kind of partnering with this conservancy is that the conservancy would be the philanthropic arm and eventually rise up to have a really big impact and help to cut into the big needs at Balboa Park, which, by the way, have the latest estimate or guesstimate really puts the total tab of need at Balboa Park at about $300 million. And a lot of folks guess that it's higher than that. So as Gina pointed out, there are tons of competing interests. And there's still, this group really still hasn't proven itself in terms of its fundraising mettle and ability to serve that role as the key fundraiser for the park.
I think you're right, Kenny. I mean, that's sort of one of the questions. It's a kind of a policy and community question. Where do we want to put our money? Do we want to put our money in a football stadium? Do we want to put it in, something that is used by everybody? At some point, if you spend any time in San Diego, you're going to end up in Balboa Park. And I think that's a discussion that, in some ways, the city's unwilling to have. I think what that clip shows that the city kind of washing its hands, saying this, we can't maintain this.
So, Amy, where does this whole process go from here?
Well, the Conservancy is actually pretty excited right now, believe it or not. They feel like they have some things lined up that are pretty exciting related to this project. They recently hired an architect who has actually recently worked on the new pavilion building in the Japanese Friendship Garden. So this firm has Balboa Park experience and experience with some of the challenges that come along with all the stakeholders in Balboa Park. So they think that they will have a stronger story to tell, pictures, drawings, different things that they can show philanthropists to get them excited about investment. And the Conservancy has also, in more recent time, had hired a new CEO and also a development staffer that they believe can really help sell this project, where in the past they were largely really relying on volunteers to go out and tell this story. And while those volunteers were really passionate, they didn't have the professional fundraising experience or the time to put into it that a full-time staffer does.
So, Amy, in our last few seconds, do they have any target date for the completion of this entire project?
Well, initially they were hoping to have it done before the
Lisa,
2015
yes.
exposition, but then they now are looking more at 2018 or so. They're really hopeful that they can get it done by then, which is actually the 150th anniversary of Balboa Park.
Okay.
Something to shoot for.
Well, thank you very much. That wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. We'd like to thank Gina Diamante, Greg Moran, and Lisa Halverstadt for joining me. And a reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. And I'm Kenny Goldberg. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Roundtable.